I am going to officially respond to Barbarossa's 2.5-hour-long video response to me very soon, and I promise that my response will be less than an hour long. And I'm also going to include a response to comments from Razorblade Candy and Stardust. But before I do that, I want to say a little bit about Gynocentrism, a term that seems to have a lot of people confused. This is the father of the concept of Gynocentrism. He was born in the year 1840, and his name is William Graham Sumner. He was arguably the first sociologist, and while Sumner is a difficult man to categorize, he was definitely a philosopher, and he's been credited, along with Adam Smith, for laying the foundations for what is known as the libertarian school of thought. Some people also consider him to be a social Darwinist, but that's debatable. What is not debatable, however, is that he was very influential. His name might not be anywhere near as well known as Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, or Adam Smith, but his ideas are very well known. In his work, Folkways, he attempted to explain how traditions and cultures arise and how they are sustained. His thinking anticipates the modern concept of memetics, as he was applying the theory of evolution by natural selection to the understanding of the forces that shape both cultural and economic structures, as opposed to merely biological structures. He also comments on the evolutionary and societal origins of sex differences, on sex relations, on marriage, and on the family. He was a fierce opponent of social engineering, but most importantly, he developed a concept for which he coined the term ethnocentrism, which I will now elaborate on. Some of you might be inclined to think of this as somehow ironic or contradictory, that someone who would now, no doubt, be regarded as an enemy of the left, as an enemy of progress, and as an evil, scary, and disgusting man, would have invented a concept like ethnocentrism and introduced it to the social sciences. A term and a concept which modern leftists and cultural Marxists and so-called liberals depend so heavily on. But if you look closely, you will find that there is no real contradiction in his ideas. He was both an intellectual and a creative genius, not a politician. He was free to be honest, objective, and spontaneous. He was concerned with accurately describing reality, not with who would be using his ideas or to what end. According to Sumner, ethnocentrism is a technical name for this view of things in which one's own group is the center of everything, and all others are scaled and rated with reference to it. Folkways correspond to it to cover both the inner and the outer relation. And what he means by folkways is that the group must have its own unique norms, customs, and values. In other words, it is the unique ways of doing things or viewing things that define that group, that bind that group together, and that also distinguish that group from all other groups. So again, folkways correspond to it to cover both the inner and the outer relation. He continues, each group nourishes its own pride and vanity, boasts itself superior, exalts its own divinities, and looks with contempt on outsiders. Each group thinks its own folkways the only right ones, and if it observes that other groups have other folkways, these excite its scorn. Opprobrious epithets are derived from these differences. The most important fact is that ethnocentrism leads a people to exaggerate and intensify everything in their own folkways, which is peculiar and which differentiates them from others. It therefore strengthens the folkways. Sumner himself never attempted to apply his concept of ethnocentrism to the sexes, but much later feminist thinkers did because they were in need of an explanation for what they viewed as perpetuation of patriarchy, gender roles, and the gender-based division of labor. Naturally, feminists introduced the term androcentrism in order to describe a culture which is created by men and for men, and where women don't really belong or fit in, and where women would inevitably be viewed as weird, as disruptive, as burdensome, as weak, and as inferior. This concept of androcentrism could have easily at one time or another been applied to domains such as sports, the sciences, the workplace, and to any domain that is visibly masculinized and male-dominated. Second-wave feminists felt that it was important to be more inclusive of women in such domains and to welcome women into traditionally male spaces, such as sports, for example, and androcentrism was problematic for them because it was acting as a barrier that was ultimately keeping women out of positions of power and authority, and thereby perpetuating both patriarchy and misogynistic beliefs and attitudes. This is precisely how Anita Sarkeesian, Rebecca Watson, and like-minded feminists are attempting to modify gamer culture and the New Skeptics and Atheist Club. They are attempting to neutralize the perceived androcentrism of these subcultures, whether they call it androcentrism or not, and this is their way of removing barriers and obstacles for women. Unfortunately, their approach was to rely on hysteria and demagogy in order to sell their idea that androcentrism was a real problem and that radical reform was necessary. However, I do think that both the new Atheist Club and the gamer culture were, and probably still are, somewhat androcentric. Androcentrism describes a certain type of bias, a certain perspective, a certain view of things. Androcentrism describes a view of things which you would expect to see in a culture that was created by men and for men. Androcentrism is characteristic of a culture that is created by the male mind and with the male mind in mind. It focuses on what the male focuses on, and it ignores what the male ignores. It is what you would expect from a misogynistic boys' club where women are not as welcome, where women don't really belong, where women are the numerical minority, and where women are implicitly or explicitly considered to be inferior to men. Androcentrism describes any domain where masculine perspectives prevail, where everyone, whether male or female, is judged by masculine norms and masculine standards, and where everyone is presumed to be male by default. Androcentrism describes a culture where men are familiar and easily understood, and where women are mysterious and exotic. A world where women are the other. A world where women might as well be alien creatures. Androcentrism describes a man's world and also a man's worldview. Similarly, Gynocentrism also describes a certain bias, a certain perspective, and a certain view of things. Gynocentrism describes a view of things that you would expect to see in a culture that was created by women and for women. Gynocentrism is characteristic of a culture that is generated by the female mind and with the female mind in mind. It focuses on what the female focuses on and ignores what the female ignores. It is what you would expect from a misandric girls' club where men are not as welcome, where men don't really belong, where men are the numerical minority, and where men are implicitly or explicitly considered to be inferior to women. Gynocentrism describes any domain where feminine perspectives prevail, where everyone, whether male or female, is judged by feminine norms and standards, and where everyone is presumed to be female by default. Gynocentrism describes a culture where women are familiar and easily understood, and where men are mysterious and exotic. A world where men are the other. A world where men might as well be alien creatures. Gynocentrism describes a woman's world and also a woman's worldview. Some obviously gynocentric domains include Lilith Fair, The Oprah Show, and Tumblr. Theoretically, every social structure and every social space would occupy a position on a continuum somewhere between extreme androcentrism on the one end and extreme gynocentrism on the other. But how do you know if a group or a culture is androcentric, gynocentric, or neither? What evidence could you use to make a case for one or the other? The easiest and most reliable way to measure this would be to count the members and participants and see how many males and females you have. Another would be to look at the leaders and the creators and count the number of males and females. Another would be to look at the overall themes and ideas that characterize the culture and look for evidence of masculinity or femininity. Another would be to look for patterns in the derogatory words that are used. And another would be to look for other clues. For example, generally speaking, women don't view other women as sex objects, but men do view women as sex objects. So if a culture places women in the category of sex object, then what does that tell you about the culture? All by itself, that observation is not conclusive, but on the face of it, is very suggestive of an androcentric bias, because it's more in line with the male perspective than the female perspective. Here's another example. I once heard a woman say that she had a problem in her sexual relationships with men. For some reason, every single man in her long list of male sexual partners was having trouble with getting and maintaining an erection. But she didn't have any question in her mind about why this was the case. She believed that it was because she was so sexually attractive to those men that she was making these men feel intimidated and nervous. As a result of this, she thought that these men were experiencing performance anxiety, as though sexual intercourse was really all about her feelings, her impressions, and her pleasure. I found this fascinating. I couldn't believe how blind and ignorant she was to the male mind, as though the act of being sexually aroused was reduced to a kind of performance. As though the Yerkes-Dodson law, which maps performance onto arousal, could also be applied to sexual arousal and sexual performance. And as a result, she finds that she can't turn men on because she's just too extremely sexy and she's making them feel inadequate and inferior. Of course, that must be the answer. To a female mind that is blinded by gynocentrism and can't understand how men think, that must make sense. But to the rest of us, this just sounds ridiculous. It seemed obvious to me that she did not consult any of her male friends in order to get their perspective, and if she did, then they were probably just pandering to her ego and her belief that she's really hot. Much hotter than most other women. And so they encouraged her to believe this nonsense. And the involvement of feminism can be another clue. Some feminists have decided that it was a good idea to promote the opposite of androcentrism, or gynocentrism, deliberately, as well as building spaces reserved exclusively for women in order to advance other causes like empowering women, recruiting women, or promoting equality between the sexes. Just as with ethnocentrism, gynocentrism nourishes its own pride and vanity, boasts itself superior, exalts its own divinities, and looks with contempt on outsiders, as Sumner states. And this has often been justified and rationalized in the name of promoting equality. Hence, you have all these special groups and clubs devoted to celebrating women, glorifying women, or empowering women, and they all exaggerate the differences between men and women, while promoting misandry and misunderstandings about men. But that is not where gynocentrism ends. Christina Hoff Sommers talked about gynocentrism in her book, The War Against Boys, where she described an education system that is designed by females and for females, and where boys are struggling, misunderstood, and viewed as inferior and as misfits, even though they're formally welcome to participate. In fact, their attendance is mandatory, but they still drop out in larger numbers, and there's a significant pressure on them to conform to feminine standards and behave like girls. Males are not in the minority of students in the early grades, but they are the minority of teachers, and they're viewed as inferior. The boy crisis can be seen as a result of a gynocentric education system that shows a bias and a preference for females. Similarly, the effects of fatherlessness can be attributed to the effects of gynocentrism, because the fatherless family is also presumably a gynocentric family. Extreme gynocentrism is stifling because feminization is stifling. Extreme safety is dangerous. The womb soon becomes the tomb. Here's a great quote from Aaron Pizzey. The others quickly realized I was a rebel, and before long I was drummed out of the group. I left, but I learned a very valuable lesson about girls. Girls hunt in packs, and they hunt those who dare challenge them. They grow into women and behave in much the same way. This pack mentality is what underpins the profitable financial markets that prey on the majority of women's desire to conform. If the leader of the pack says jump, women ask how high. If fashion dictates that they have to wear 5-inch heels, they wear 5-inch heels. Safety, conformity, and obedience is feminine. Exploration, innovation, and rebellion is masculine. So it should be the case that culture is born androcentric and becomes more and more gynocentric over time. This is also the basis of O-Sullivan's law. What O-Sullivan was describing was the difference between masculine versus feminine values and orientation. He identified the feminine attitudes with the left, and the masculine attitudes with the right. So it sounds like he's talking about left versus right politics, but really he's talking about truth, tolerance, and innovation. You might not have the same definition of left and right as O-Sullivan, especially given that feminine values are much more conservative and traditional in many respects. My point is just to say that O-Sullivan was drawing attention to a real pattern that is probably better seen as a tendency to move from androcentrism to gynocentrism over time. This has also been noticed in the art world, and it's usually referred to as selling out. So on the one hand, the places where women congregate tend towards gynocentrism, and on the other hand, the places where males congregate tend towards androcentrism. But society as a whole is neither appreciably gynocentric nor androcentric. Society as a whole contains a balance of feminine and masculine perspectives, feminine and masculine preferences, and feminine and masculine forces. When a subculture is clearly made by men and for men, then it is clearly androcentric. And it's clearly gynocentric when it's made by women and for women. But what about a culture that's produced by men and for women? Or one that's produced by women and for men? This is where it gets much more difficult to pin down. It's fairly easy for feminists to just cherry-pick the facts in order to make the case that some product or industry is androcentric if either its consumers are mostly male or if its producers are mostly male. And if either the consumers or the producers are mostly female, then they can just sweep that one inconvenient fact under the rug. And some people in the manosphere cherry-pick as well in order to say that society as a whole is gynocentric. We already know, for example, that adult males have been assigned to the role of protector and provider with respect to both women and children, our weakest and most vulnerable members, throughout history, in order to promote survival, and this includes the survival of men and boys. It is a fact that the safety and survival of women and children has always been prioritized, in some sense, and that society has historically had much lower expectations for both women and children in many areas. But what does this fact really have to do with gynocentrism? We know that sperm is cheap and that eggs are expensive, and that women are the operational bottleneck with respect to our overall reproductive capacity. But again, what does this really have to do with gynocentrism? It's true that men work harder and sacrifice more and take more risks, in part because they're more disposable to the tribe, and in part because their incentives to work are different from those of women. But what does that really have to do with gynocentrism? The misconception that I want to address here is that gynocentrism is a reference to that which benefits women as a group, or that which helps women exclusively, or that which prioritizes the interests of women. Gynocentrism does not mean helping women, benefiting women, or promoting the interests of women. A culture that is truly gynocentric would not help, benefit, or promote the interests of women per se. Rather, it would pander to women's sensibilities, women's perspectives, women's beliefs, women's misconceptions, women's traditions, women's values, and women's preferences. If society were truly gynocentric, then men would probably be viewed as generally inferior, They would probably be in the numerical minority, they would probably contribute less to the culture, and you would not find men occupying the majority of the positions of power, influence, prestige, and leadership in society. Gynocentrism and androcentrism both exist, but society as a whole is neither gynocentric nor androcentric. Furthermore, that which promotes the survival for the species or the tribe cannot favor the interests of one sex over the other, because the interests of both sexes are interdependent with each other and with the interests of the species or the tribe. It doesn't even make sense to talk about men's collective interests or women's collective interests. It's really nonsensical. When it comes to survival, the sexes are codependent, they're not competitors. And when it comes to beauty, power, and status, you need to look at what gives beauty, power, and status its value. That value comes from their utility in the mating game, and in the mating game, it's pretty clear that men and women are not actually rivals. And with respect to the modern monogamous marriage, which is alleged by some to be a gynocentric institution, is it really? Sure, it offers different incentives for men and women, and wedding ceremonies do appear to have become extremely gynocentric. But is monogamous marriage really gynocentric when compared to the alternative arrangement? What does it even mean to say that marriage is a gynocentric institution? It can't mean that marriage is created by women and for women. It can't mean that marriage excludes men. So it must mean that marriage benefits women at men's expense. But as I already explained, benefiting women at the expense of men is not what gynocentrism really refers to. Furthermore, it's not even true that marriage benefits men at the expense of women, especially when you consider the competing alternative to monogamous marriage. The alternative arrangement is polygamy, where a small percentage of alpha men reproduce, and the average man doesn't. For men, the prevalence of monogamous marriage means that men are not allowed to have more than one mate, which clashes with his promiscuous instincts. But at least he has a much better chance of finding a mate. For women, monogamous marriage means that most women will have to settle for an average man, which clashes with her hypergamous instincts. But at least she won't have to share a man with other women. It's not inherently gynocentric or androcentric. It's basically a guarantee for men that they'll be able to find a woman to reproduce with, and it's a guarantee for women that they won't have to share a man. Monogamous marriage comes with both a cost and a benefit to both men and women. Monogamous marriage is like socialism for men, in contrast to the winner-takes-all model that polygamy represents. A polygamous marriage could be considered androcentric because the man is at the center and acts as the head of the household, but it could also be considered gynocentric because women and children are the numerical majority, and because the majority of young men are excluded and banished from these societies once they reach sexual maturity. Men are not welcome, only the man is welcome, and this is because sperm is cheaper than eggs. Now, what about the relationship between feminism and gynocentrism? Well, in some ways, gynocentrism and feminism are linked, but the relationship is complicated. First, we need a definition of feminism. Feminism is tricky to define, but it's clearly an ideology and a worldview. It's not merely a description on how society has changed over time. Feminism is an ideology, and it's an ideology that views the sexes as being in conflict, and it seeks to help the female sex to win this conflict. Feminists believe in patriarchy, and they believe that patriarchy must be dismantled. Towards this end, feminism calls for more female leadership, while also presenting females as victims, and while also rebelling against the arbitrary conformity of gender roles for both men and women. So long as the sexes are viewed as being in conflict, the female side will always have more support than the male side. I repeat, so long as the sexes are viewed as being in conflict, the female side will always have more support than the male side. This is why feminism, through promoting the idea that the sexes are in conflict, and through focusing on real or imaginary conflicts between men and women, has been able to persist in spite of its intellectual bankruptcy. For gullible women, their indoctrination into feminist ideology begins with the universal struggle of me versus the world, which we can all relate to, but then it's quickly translated to the nonsensical struggle of women versus the world. And then with more indoctrination, this morphs into women versus the patriarchy. And eventually it settles into women versus men at the final stage. Part of this is women defending what they believe is their own self-interest, and part of it is women's desire to conform and be accepted by other women. That is the confusion of feminism in a nutshell. And if you've ever wondered why people say that some of these MGTOWs are just like the feminists, that's the reason why they say it. And why would you want to be just as confused as the feminists? Just as misguided as the feminists? Just as gullible as the feminists? Or just as sheepish as the feminists? For men, on the other hand, they have different reasons for taking women's side when they see a conflict. Men are warriors, and as warriors we're capable of seeing other men as the enemy, but it's much harder for us to view women as the enemy. And it's true, after all, that women are not the enemy. In truth, there is no gender war. There's only gender mercenaries and gender demagogues who profit from the belief that a gender war exists, and from the damage that a phony gender war causes. If you still think that a gender war is real, then you haven't taken the red pill. It's that simple.